Now, welcome back to part three. So now we've seen ethical egoism and psychological egoism. We've seen how they're distinct views. But now we're going to consider an argument from how you can go from psychological egoism to ethical egoism. So this turns on widely held moral principle, ought implies can. So the thought here is that morality can only require you to do things that you're actually capable of doing, that you can do. You can't be required to, run really fast to save somebody's life if you're not able to run really fast. If you are able to run really fast, then it doesn't mean that you will have that obligation, but it allows that you can. It's possible you do. But if you are obliged to do something, then that implies that you are able to do it. If you're obliged to save someone from a burning building, it implies that you can do it. And anything you're not able to do, you're not obliged to do. You have no obligation to do, because you can't. There's no way that morality can make you do something that you're not able to do. So is the idea with ought implies can. So importantly, notice the connection between the normative and the descriptive here. So we're going from an ought claim to a can claim. One gone from a normative claim to a descriptive claim. So the normative here is thought to imply the descriptive. A normative, whether you have an obligation, which is normative, implies something about you, an ability that you have. If you fail to have that ability or capability, then you can't have the obligation. So this suggests that maybe psychological egoism can identify something about you that makes you special from the standpoint of morality, from a moral point of view. Psychological egoism is true. The special relationship that you have to yourself is that your interests are the only ones that you're capable of pursuing as ends in themselves. So remember that psychological egoism says that it's only possible, you are only capable of pursuing what's in your own interest. So that means that your capabilities are limited by what's in your interest. Morality can't, if ought implies can is true, then morality can't morally require you to do things that are not in your self-interest, because you're just not able to do that. The kind of being you are is just one who's only capable of pursuing things that are in their own self-interest, as ends in themselves at least. So if ought implies can is true, morality is limited to what we're capable of, then that makes each person's interest special to them from the point of view of morality, right? Because your interests are the only things you're capable of pursuing as ends in themselves. This gives us the following argument that takes us from psychological egoism to ethical egoism. So here, premise one, the only thing each person is capable of pursuing is their own self-interest. Remember, that's just a statement of psychological egoism. Premise two, each person can only be morally required to pursue things that they are capable of pursuing. That's just another way of stating ought implies can. And three, each person is morally required to pursue some things. So this premise is needed to sort of get you any requirements, it needs to be true that you have some requirements in order to have some requirements. And from these three premises, it follows that the only thing that each person is morally required to pursue, as to say morally should pursue, is their own self-interest. So notice here we've moved from psychological egoism to ethical egoism. Now I want to consider arguments against psychological egoism. So if it's a case we can get from psychological egoism to ethical egoism, and seems like a fairly uncontroversial argument. Ought implies can has been disputed by some people, but it's generally taken to be true. So we're not going to question that here today, but it's something you could question. And three, it does seem that people are morally required to pursue some things, and that could also be something that follows from ought implies can, given that people are capable of doing some things. So premise three doesn't seem controversial either. So given this argument looks valid, if we're going to resist its conclusion, we have to reject one of its premises. So we're going to focus on trying to reject premise one, trying to reject psychological egoism. So Joel Feinberg has a very clever argument, a very insightful argument against psychological egoism. He thinks it's either trivial or false. So it's common in philosophy to say claims are trivial. It just means that they're so obvious and so interesting that nothing really significant follows from them. And so some forms that psychological egoism take are just seem to just amount to saying that your motives are your motives and no one else's. Your desires are satisfied when your desires are satisfied. I mean, that's obviously true. You can only ever act from your own motives. That's just how agents are. They have beliefs, desires, intentions, values. Anything that might motivate you is necessarily going to be your own. You can't be, if you're motivated to do something by somebody else, it necessarily has to go through your psychology. So if somebody says, quick, move your head, there's a ball coming, you have to have the motive, you have to have the desire to want to move away from the ball, even if the person's told you to do that. That just seems to be how actions work. So you always seem to be acting on your own motives and no one else's. And of course, if your desires are satisfied, they're always satisfied when your desires are satisfied. That's just obvious. So Feinberg is going to argue that, some understandings of psychological egoism are just trivial. It's just really trivial and uninteresting, and nothing really follows from that. You can't take this sort of trivial point and then get to ethical egoism. So you have to go for a more substantive understanding of psychological egoism. You have to go for the understanding that it's about pursuing things as ends in themselves. And that's it. But Feinberg thinks he wants to show that this is actually false. So he thinks it's going to be false that your motives concern only your own interests and no one else's, or that your desires are always for your own gain and no one else's. He thinks that that's demonstrably false. He's got various arguments to show that. So ultimately, Feinberg wants to get us to this view. He wants to say, look, it's not the genesis of an action or the origin of those motives which makes it a selfish one, but rather the purpose of the act or the objective of its motives, not where the motive comes from. In involuntary actions, it always comes from the agent. But what it aims at determines whether or not it's selfish. So ultimately, he's going to say, look, the selfishness doesn't come from the fact of your motives. They're always going to be your motives. Selfishness is going to come at taking your own end, taking something taking the end of an action as purely something in your own self-interest. It matters where the action's aiming. What are you trying to do with this action? What's the end you're aiming for? What's the objective, the aim? So if you help somebody out, why are you helping them out? If you're helping them out just to get something for yourself, then that might be a selfish motive there, because you're ultimately helping them out to get something else. And this is important to think about if you're thinking about the example from Friends, when Joey's talking about, feeling good or things like that. If you help somebody out just to feel good at the end, and that seems selfish. But to think to yourself, is that what Phoebe's doing when she becomes a surrogate mother for her estranged brother? It doesn't seem so. She might well feel good at the end, but that wasn't why she did it. She may have benefited, but that wasn't why she did it. It's just something that came along afterwards. But Feinberg has other points to make. So one of the very interesting points he makes is counterexamples to acting in your own interests. So he thinks that benevolence might be one that you think quite obviously here, right? So if you're Phoebe or anyone who's a surrogate for another parent voluntarily, you might think that they're doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They're going through quite a sort of physically and psychologically intensive process for somebody else's benefit. Now, if you were doing it for money, then it's not really out of that benevolence. But if you're just doing it to help somebody out, you're doing it to help them out. And you seem to be sacrificing your interests in the process. You're putting the interests of somebody else first and setting back your interests just to help them. That's benevolent. That's a nice thing to do. That's, it's praiseworthy. And you put somebody else first. So it seems like you've taken someone else's an end of themselves, and you've done something for them. And you're not just using them to get something nice for you. You might well feel good at the end, but if you're doing it to help them out, if that's the purpose of what you're doing, then you're not acting on selfish motives. But interestingly, it's not just doing good that Feinberg thinks gets you a counterexample. He thinks also doing bad. So he thinks that malevolence is often also a counterexample. So sometimes we aim to harm people just because we really hate them, for example. Like you really want to do whatever it takes to set back their interests. But in the process, you might also set back your own interests. Somebody who goes on like a revenge spree, like an evil revenge spree, that they really want to harm somebody else, being very malevolent, they might completely ruin their own lives in the process because they're aiming to harm that person at the expense of their own interests. So malevolence, at least sometimes, seems to also be a counterexample. Malevolence is also, in a way, unselfish because it's got the other person, it's taking the other person's interest as its focus. It may well, in the case of malevolence, you're trying to damage those interests, whereas in the case of benevolence, you're trying to promote those interests. So think of Joey again, like he's saying that's selfish. Like Phoebe again doesn't seem to be being selfish. If she's helping out her brother just to help him out, then she's not being selfish. But maybe here the ethical egoist is going to push back and say, look, people aren't ever really acting for the benefit of others. Notice that the benevolent person is going to, feel happy or feel pleased at what they did in the same way that Phoebe felt happy about helping her brother and being a surrogate for her brother and his wife. So ultimately, the benevolent person is actually acting in their own interest, for their own pleasure. It's always a self-interested end. Likewise, you might think the benevolent person is always trying to get their own satisfaction. They want the satisfaction of harming the other person, and that's really what they're going for all along. So again, another self-interested end. Now, what do you think about this argument? Feinberg thinks something dodgy going on here, but he thinks this. But rather than just sort of rejecting it, he thinks there's another. If the ethical, psychological egoist takes this line of response, this leads to a second worry. And this is that psychological egoism seems unfalsifiable. Right? What does it mean to say something's unfalsifiable? It means that there's no way of actually showing it's false. So if it's the case that people always really act on their own self-interest, that's actually an empirical claim, something that's supposed to be true about people. It's quite a major one. So if we're making empirical claims, there should, at least in principle, be a way of showing that they're false. Now, how can we show that it's false? Well, what would be the way of showing that people sometimes don't act in their own self-interest? Remember here, the psychological egoist is insisting that really, really everyone is always acting in their own self-interest. But how would we disprove that? If they're always doing it, there's no way to actually disprove it. There's no real counterexample that could come up here. Because in the end, each one is going to be, according to the psychological egoist who makes this move, that we're always really acting in our own self-interest. Ultimately, that's just always going to be the case. That means that they can't actually provide you an example of what it would be like for a person to act not in their own self-interest. And that's a worry there. So why there's something dodgy there if you can't actually show that it's false? Like there needs to be there's no actual examples of what somebody not acting on their own self-interest is, then we haven't got something to compare the person acting on their own self-interest to. So we have this case of somebody acting on their own self-interest. Well, what would it be to do something different? We just don't know because everyone's always acting on their own self-interest in a way that we can't really compare to something else or even disprove. The worry here is, what makes something actually an empirical claim is that it is falsifiable, right? What will be another empirical claim? Or that the sun rises every day. We can know, like, the sun rises every day. How would that be falsifiable? If you could show there wasn't, in fact, a sun there, we can know what that's like. Or the earth is round. A way to disprove that would be to, fly a plane into the sky and show that it's flat, or go far enough out that we can see that it's actually flat. I mean, the earth is actually round, but at least in principle, possible to disprove it. We can say what it would be like to disprove a claim like the earth is round. We can't seemingly do that with psychological egoism, at least the psychological egoist that says that we're always, just as a matter of fact, as a matter of, almost as a matter of fiat, that people are always acting in their own self-interest. Feinberg then goes on to say that actually ethical egoism is also, psychological egoism, sorry, is also self-defeating. So what's interesting here is that sometimes acting in our own self-interest can only be pursued by pursuing something else. So we can sometimes only satisfy our own self-interests by pursuing something else. So Feinberg says, an exclusive desire for happiness is the surest way to prevent happiness from coming into being. So imagine here the person who only acts on her self-interest says, I'm only going to act in my self-interest, and I'm going to try and become the happiest person ever. People who often try to do these kinds of things often fail. The way to becoming happy or meeting your self-interest is often to aim to do other things, like be around people, have healthy relationships, have fun projects, engaging projects, and then happiness should come along. And so here, Feinberg goes on to say the pure egoist would be the most wretched person, because the pure egoist here, as he's imagining it, would be so focused on themselves and trying to make themselves happy that they wouldn't realize that the way of actually making themselves happy and actually getting things that are in their self-interest is by not really thinking about what's in their self-interest and having other hobbies and other interests and putting other people first. And then they might actually get these things which are in their self-interest as a byproduct. The thought here is that if you actually make your focus of what you do as being things in your own self-interest, you actually might not get the things that are in your self-interest. And it's much better to sort of pursue things which are not in your self-interest, and then things which are in your self-interest will come along. But if that's right, then what you should, from the point of view of your own self-interest, is pursue other things than your own self-interest. You should be pursuing, other people's happiness, other projects which aren't to do with you, or that aren't really putting your self-interest in focus. You should just be focused on those other pursuits. So this suggests that maybe prudential and moral goods are actually distinct after all. Now it could still be the case that it's nonetheless prudentially good to be morally good. That is in fact Plato's view. Now in the rest of the lectures we're not going to focus on Plato's view, but if you want to read more about Plato's view that it's prudentially good to be morally good, something that I suggest you read up more on. In the next lectures we're going to be focused on a paper by Philippa Foot, and then a paper by Susan Wolf, and then we'll end on a paper by Marcia Barron. And each of these views are going to focus on the relationship between morality and other normative domains, and provide other answers to the question, why be good? So as it stands, it looks like, psychological egoism doesn't seem like a very plausible thesis. And so we don't really get a unique argument for ethical egoism. The arguments for ethical egoism themselves, according to Rachel's, aren't very plausible, and there seems to be good arguments against ethical egoism. So as it stands, it seems that, why be good because it's all you can do is perhaps not the best answer to that question. But if you're interested more on these topics, it's worth reading up more because there's a rich philosophical literature around these issues.